I never thought I'd be telling this story. The day I watched my grandfather's historic barn burn to the ground, reduced to ashes by an HOA's vindictive campaign of harassment, changed everything. My name is Jack Mitchell, and this is the story of how I took on a power-hungry Homeowners Association and won a $600,000 settlement that shocked our entire community. But more than the money, this is about standing up to bullies who think they can destroy a family's heritage just because it doesn't fit their perfect suburban vision. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Mitchell family farm has been a fixture in Rolling Hills County since 1932. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands during the Great Depression, and for 90 years it stood as a testament to our family's dedication to this land. 20 acres of fertile soil passed down through 3 generations, where we've grown everything from corn to pumpkins, raising cattle and keeping a small apple orchard that local families visit every fall. I inherited the farm from my father in 2008, and for years everything was peaceful. Sure, the suburbs were creeping closer, new developments sprouting up like mushrooms after rain, but our farm predated all of it. We were here first, and everyone seemed to understand that. The kids from nearby neighborhoods would stop by to pet the horses, and their parents would buy our fresh produce. We were part of the community's charm. That all changed when Oak Ridge Estates started development in 2022. It wasn't just another subdivision, it was marketed as an exclusive luxury community with immaculate lawns, coordinated mailboxes, and strict architectural guidelines. The houses started at $800,000, and the people moving in had very specific ideas about what their dream neighborhood should look like. Leading the charge was Victoria Pierce, a former corporate executive who'd appointed herself president of the newly formed Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She had a vision of creating what she called the most prestigious address in Rolling Hills County. The problem: our farm, which had been here for nearly a century, didn't fit into her vision of perfection. At first, the letters seemed almost comical, complaints about our roosters crowing too early on a farm that predated their houses by 90 years, concerns about the visual impact of our tractors, suggestions that we should modernize our operations to better align with their community standards. I kept every single one of those letters, and thank God I did. They would later become crucial evidence in court. I tried to be neighborly about it. When Victoria first came to my door with her HOA welcome packet and perfectly practiced smile, I listened politely. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, smoothing her designer blazer, "Oak Ridge Estates represents a new chapter for this area. We believe your property could benefit enormously from joining our association. We have resources, connections, and a vision for the future." I thanked her but declined. My farm wasn't part of their development, and I had no interest in letting a group of newcomers dictate how I should manage land that my family had worked for generations. That's when I saw the first flash of what lay beneath Victoria's polished exterior, a momentary hardening of her eyes that warned of troubles to come. "I hope you'll reconsider," she said, her smile never wavering. "It would be a shame if your operations began to conflict with our community guidelines." I didn't know it then, but that conversation was the beginning of a nightmare that would culminate in watching my grandfather's barn go up in flames. The HOA's campaign of harassment would test my resolve, threaten my livelihood, and ultimately lead to a courtroom showdown that would expose the dark side of HOA overreach. What happened over the next 8 months would shock our quiet farming community and make headlines across the state. But sitting here now, looking out at our rebuilt barn and the no HOA jurisdiction sign that stands proudly at our property line, I can tell you this: sometimes you have to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. The harassment started slowly, But it would soon escalate into something none of us could have imagined. And when the smoke finally cleared, both literally and figuratively, nothing would ever be the same in Rolling Hills County. The first real sign of trouble came during our annual Fall Harvest Festival. For decades, we'd hosted local families for hay rides, pumpkin picking, and apple cider pressing. The festival wasn't just tradition, it was how we connected with our community. But that October, Victoria Pierce saw an opportunity to flex her HOA's muscle. 3 days before the festival, a city inspector showed up at my door. He seemed apologetic as he handed me a stack of paperwork. "We've received multiple complaints about potential code violations," he explained, "concerns about parking, noise ordinances, and public gathering permits. In 15 years of running the festival, we'd never needed special permits. We were agricultural land, exempt from most city regulations. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Through the inspector's visit, I spotted Victoria's silver Mercedes, parked just beyond my property line watching. She'd brought reinforcements too, Marcus Chen, the HOA's vice president, and Diana Wells, their community standards officer. They weren't even trying to hide their involvement. I spent the next 2 days racing between city offices, gathering the suddenly required permits. It cost nearly $2,000 in rush fees, but I was determined not to let the HOA ruin an event that meant so much to local families. What I didn't expect was what happened next. The morning of the festival, every road leading to our farm was lined with no parking signs. They were official city signs, but I later learned that the HOA had donated them to the city specifically for this purpose. They'd also arranged for aggressive parking enforcement. Any car that dared to pull over would be ticketed immediately. Still, people came. They parked at the shopping center a mile away and walked. Parents carried their children on shoulders, determined to continue the tradition. By mid-afternoon, we had a decent crowd, despite the HOA's best efforts. That's when Victoria made her grand entrance. She walked right into the middle of our pumpkin patch, designer boots sinking into the mud, flanked by Marcus and Diana. The conversations around us hushed as people sensed the confrontation coming. "Mr. Mitchell," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this gathering is in direct violation of Oak Ridge Estates community standards. The noise, the traffic, the unsightly commercial activity, it's all unacceptable." I kept my voice calm, aware of all the families watching. "Victoria, this farm isn't part of Oak Ridge Estates. We've been hosting this festival since before you had even heard of Rolling Hills County." She smiled, that practiced smile again. "Times change, Mr. Mitchell. This area is evolving, and you need to evolve with it. Join the HOA, and we can work together to make your activities more suitable for our community's standards." "And if I don't?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Then we'll have to take whatever steps necessary to protect our property values and community standards." She glanced meaningfully at the families around us. "I'm sure none of our residents want their children exposed to unregulated agricultural activities, the dust, the allergens, the potential liability issues." It was a threat, plain and simple. She was trying to turn our neighbors against us, painting our family farm as some kind of hazard. But she had miscalculated. One of the mothers stepped forward, Sarah Thompson, whose kids had been coming to our festival since they could walk. "The only hazard I see here," Sarah said firmly, "is someone trying to bully a family farm that's been part of this community for generations." Victoria's smile tightened, but she kept her composure. "We'll see about that," she said quietly, before turning on her heel and marching back to her Mercedes, leaving muddy boot prints across our pumpkin patch. That evening, after the last families had left, I found a formal notice taped to my front door. The HOA was filing a complaint with the city about commercial agriculture in a residential zone. It didn't matter that our farm predated any zoning laws. They were going to try every angle they could. I sat on my porch that night, looking out at the barn my grandfather built, its weathered wood glowing in the sunset. The festival signs were still up. The pumpkin patch showed the day's happy traffic, and somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, ignoring the HOA's complaints about his early morning habits. That's when I made the decision. I wasn't just going to resist their pressure, I was going to document everything. Every letter, every inspection, every interaction. I had no way of knowing then just how important that documentation would become, or how far Victoria Pierce and her HOA would go in their campaign to force us out. Little did I know, the fall Harvest Festival drama was just the beginning. The HOA was about to escalate their tactics in ways that would test not just my resolve, but the very foundations of our community. And that beautiful old barn, standing proud against the darkening sky, would soon become the centerpiece of a conflict that nobody could have predicted. In the weeks following the Fall Harvest Festival, life on the farm took on a surreal quality. Every morning brought a new challenge from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA, each more absurd than the last. They weren't just sending letters anymore. They were orchestrating a systematic campaign to make our daily operations as difficult as possible. The first major escalation came through our water rights. For nearly a century, our farm had accessed water from Chester Creek, which ran through the back of our property, but suddenly the HOA began construction on an environmental improvement project upstream from us. They claimed they were creating a wildlife sanctuary, but the result was a significant reduction in our water flow. When I confronted Victoria Pierce about it, she was ready with a stack of environmental impact studies and city permits. "We're simply protecting local wildlife," she said, that artificial smile firmly in place. "If you're concerned about water access, the HOA would be happy to connect you to the community's irrigation system, once you become a member, of course." Marcus Chen, who I'd learned was a former corporate lawyer, started showing up at city council meetings. He would speak at length about the modernization of Rolling Hills County and the need to phase out obsolete land use practices. He never mentioned our farm by name, but everyone knew what and who he was talking about. The pressure took more personal forms too. Diana Wells, the HOA's standards officer, began photographing every aspect of our property. She'd stand at the edge of our land, her expensive camera pointed at our equipment, our animals, our buildings. When I asked what she was doing, she claimed she was documenting code violations for city records. One morning, I found all our roadside produce stands had been tagged with violation notices. The HOA had lobbied the city to enforce an obscure ordinance about commercial signage in residential areas. It didn't matter that we'd had these stands for decades. Suddenly they were non-compliant. The harassment started affecting our business relationships too. Longtime customers began receiving letters from the HOA's legal team, warning them about the risks of buying produce from an unregulated agricultural operation. Some of our wholesale clients, nervous about legal complications, started reducing their orders. But the HOA's tactics weren't just aimed at our business. They were trying to isolate us socially as well. Families who had been friendly with us for years started receiving notices about unauthorized fraternization with non-compliant properties. Children who used to stop by to pet the horses were told their parents could face HOA fines for encouraging unsafe activities. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when Victoria orchestrated what she called a community health and safety survey. HOA members went door to door with questionnaires about agricultural nuisances in the neighborhood. The survey included leading questions like, "How concerned are you about dust from farming activities affecting your children's health? And would you support measures to relocate agricultural operations away from residential areas?" I might have found it almost funny if it hadn't been so calculated. Each move was designed to paint our farm as a problem that needed solving, and HOA membership as the solution. They were trying to wear us down, piece by piece. One evening, as I was fixing a fence near the property line, I overheard Victoria speaking to someone on her phone. She didn't notice me in the growing dusk. "The Mitchell situation is proving more difficult than anticipated," she was saying. "We may need to take more decisive action. The board is getting impatient and these properties aren't getting any cheaper." That's when I realized this wasn't just about community standards or property values. The HOA was likely working with developers, eyeing our land for future expansion. Our farm wasn't just an eyesore to them. It was an obstacle to their bigger plans. I decided to fight back in my own way. I set up security cameras around the property and started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction. I filed for historical property status with the county, citing our farm's long history in the community. I even reached out to local media about doing a story on traditional farming in modern suburbs, though most seemed hesitant to run anything that might antagonize the wealthy Oak Ridge Estates community. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Support came from unexpected places. Old Mrs. Henderson, whose family had farmed the next county over until developers bought them out, started bringing me newspaper clippings about similar cases. "They did the same thing to us," she told me. "Don't let them wear you down, Jack. Once these farms are gone, they're gone forever." The local farmers market community rallied around us too. They'd seen other small farms and family businesses pushed out by development, and they understood what was at stake. They helped spread the word about our situation, and some even offered legal contacts who'd dealt with HOA disputes before. But Victoria Pierce and her HOA board were just getting started. As fall turned to winter, their tactics would escalate beyond anything we could have imagined. The decisive action she'd mentioned on the phone would turn out to be more devastating than any of us could have predicted. The threat came on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside an official-looking HOA envelope. Unlike their previous letters, this one didn't bother with any pretense of professionalism. "Agricultural operations incompatible with modern residential standards must be eliminated by any means necessary." It wasn't signed, but the HOA letterhead said enough. I took the letter to the local police station, where Officer Rachel Martinez listened sympathetically but couldn't do much. "It's concerning," she admitted, "but technically it's not an explicit threat. I'll file a report, but without more direct evidence." She trailed off, and I understood. The HOA knew exactly how far they could push things, while staying just within legal bounds. What happened next, though, crossed every line. It was early December, and I was in the barn doing my morning check on our winter equipment. The temperature had dropped below freezing overnight, and I wanted to make sure our heating systems were working properly for the animals. That's when I noticed something odd about the barn's main electrical panel. The lock had been tampered with, and when I opened the panel, the sight made my blood run cold. Someone had deliberately crossed several wires, creating a serious fire hazard. If I hadn't checked it that morning, I didn't want to think about what could have happened. I was still documenting the tampering with my phone when I heard a crunch of tires on frozen gravel. Victoria Pierce's Mercedes was pulling up, with Marcus Chen and 2 other HOA board members in tow. This time, they didn't wait for an invitation. "Mr. Mitchell," Victoria called out, striding toward the barn, as if she owned it. "The board has called an emergency meeting about your property. We thought it would be courteous to inform you in person." I stepped between them and the barn entrance. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Marcus Chen stepped forward, adjusting his designer glasses. We have documentation of multiple code violations that constitute an immediate community safety risk. As representatives of the Homeowners Association, we have a responsibility to... You have no authority here. I cut him off. And someone just tampered with my electrical panel. Care to explain that? Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Are you suggesting the HOA had something to do with your maintenance issues? That's a serious accusation, Mr. Mitchell, one that could have legal consequences if voiced publicly. Is that another threat? Simply a statement of fact. She pulled out her phone and began recording. We're here to document ongoing safety violations, the deteriorating condition of your structures, the improper storage of agricultural equipment, the unauthorized livestock operations in a residential zone. This is an active farm that predates your entire development, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. We were here first, and we're not going anywhere. Everyone goes somewhere eventually, Mr. Mitchell, Marcus added smoothly. It's just a matter of price. That's when we heard the distinct sound of a camera shutter. Looking up, I saw Diana Wells had circled around during our confrontation. She was photographing the open electrical panel. Perfect, Victoria smiled. Visual evidence of faulty wiring in an agricultural structure. The city inspector will be very interested in this. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They were setting me up. The tampering, this confrontation, the photos, it was all orchestrated. They were building a paper trail to use against me. Get off my property, I said, pulling out my own phone. I'm calling the police. No need for that, Mr. Mitchell, Victoria replied, already turning to leave. We have what we need. The board meets tomorrow to discuss next steps. This is your last chance to cooperate before we're forced to take more definitive action. As they walked back to their car, Marcus hung back for a moment. You know, he said quietly, this could all go away. Sign over the property, and we'll make sure you're generously compensated. Fight us, and well... He glanced at the barn. Old buildings like this can be so unpredictable. Electrical fires, structural failures, anything could happen. After they left, I called Officer Martinez again. This time she came out personally to document the electrical tampering and took detailed notes about the confrontation. This is different, she acknowledged. Direct trespassing, possible attempted arson. This is criminal behavior. I'll file a formal report, but Jack... She looked at me seriously. Be careful. These people clearly have resources and connections. Document everything. I spent the rest of the day installing additional security cameras and reinforcing the locks on all our buildings. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the footage of the confrontation, knowing that somewhere in Oak Ridge Estates, the HOA board was planning their next move. The day after the electrical panel incident, an unexpected ally emerged. Lisa Chen, Marcus's own sister who worked at the city planning office, requested to meet me privately at a coffee shop 2 towns over. She seemed nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder as she slid a manila envelope across the table. I can't be seen talking to you, she whispered, hands trembling around her untouched coffee. But I had to warn you, what they're planning. It's not just about your farm anymore. They're using you to set a precedent. Inside the envelope were copies of internal HOA documents, email exchanges, and development plans. The Oak Ridge Estates project was just phase 1. A larger development corporation, Summit Properties, was behind the scenes, using the HOA as a front to acquire land for a massive expansion project. Victoria isn't just the HOA president, Lisa explained, her voice barely audible. She's a senior executive at Summit. This whole HOA was engineered to pressure holdout properties like yours. They've done this in 3 other counties. The documents revealed a systematic strategy. First, build luxury homes around existing properties. Then, form an aggressive HOA to make life impossible for non-members. Finally, when owners were worn down, swoop in with lowball offers, or worse, wait for accidents to make properties unsellable. They call it community renewal in their paperwork, Lisa continued, but it's really just sophisticated land grabbing. Marcus, my brother, he's their legal architect. He designs these schemes to stay just within the law. I studied a particularly disturbing email chain between Victoria and Summit's board. They discussed accelerated acquisition strategies and leveraging community standards enforcement to create compelling sales motivation. Corporate speak for forcing people out of their homes. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked Lisa. She looked down at her hands. "Because they destroyed my parents' restaurant in Cedar Grove last year. Same tactics. Marcus chose the company over family. I can't let them keep doing this." Before leaving, Lisa gave me one last piece of information. The HOA board was planning to use the electrical panel incident as justification for an emergency property inspection. They'd already arranged for a private inspector, one on Summit's payroll, to declare the barn structurally unsound. Armed with this knowledge, I spent the next day preparing. I hired my own certified inspector, documented every inch of the barn's structure, and had an electrician examine and certify the repaired panel. I also backed up Lisa's documents in multiple secure locations. Sure enough, the next morning brought Victoria, Marcus, and their hand-picked inspector to my property. This time, I was ready. "Before you start," I interrupted their rehearsed speech, "I have a few things you should see." I handed them copies of my inspector's report, dated and notarized. "Oh, and these security camera shots of someone tampering with my electrical panel. The police have copies too. Victoria's composed facade, cracked slightly. Those documents are irrelevant. Our inspector will need to explain why he's certified under a suspended license," I cut in, watching their inspector pale. "I checked his credentials this morning." Marcus stepped forward, legal mode engaged. "Mr. Mitchell, these baseless accusations aren't baseless at all," I finished, pulling out copies of the Summit Properties documents. "Just like your connection to Summit's expansion plans isn't baseless." Interesting reading, by the way. The change in their demeanor was instant. Victoria's perfectly maintained smile vanished. Marcus actually took a step back. Their inspector, sensing the shift, quickly made his way back to his truck. "Where did you get those documents?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp. "Let's just say, not everyone agrees with your methods," I replied. "Now, would you like to discuss how this inspection could constitute criminal harassment, or should we call Officer Martinez down here to sort it out?" For the first time since this began, I saw real fear in Victoria's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by something worse, cold fury. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she hissed. "Those documents won't help you when accidents happen, and they do happen, Mr. Mitchell, more often than you'd think." As they left, Marcus lingered again, but this time his smoothness was gone. "You've made a serious mistake," he warned. "The HOA has resources you can't imagine. This won't end well for you." I watched them drive away, knowing I'd won this round, but feeling more uneasy than ever. Their threats had shifted from veiled to explicit. The documents had rattled them, but they'd also pushed them into a corner, and cornered predators are the most dangerous. The accident they orchestrated came sooner than I expected, and it was more calculated than anything I could have imagined. Just 2 days after confronting Victoria and Marcus with the Summit documents, I woke up to find my entire winter feed storage had been contaminated. Someone had broken into our storage shed overnight and sprayed our entire hay supply with some kind of chemical. The smell was unmistakable, something industrial and toxic. Nearly $50,000 worth of feed ruined. Without it, Keeping our livestock through the winter would be nearly impossible. Officer Martinez responded quickly when I called, bringing a hazmat team with her this time. "This is deliberate sabotage," she said, taking samples of the contaminated hay. "And using chemicals like this. We're not just talking about property damage anymore. This is environmental crime territory." The hazmat team's preliminary tests revealed the chemical was a commercial-grade pesticide, one that required special licensing to purchase. More importantly, it was the exact brand used by Perfect Lawns, the landscaping company contracted exclusively by Oak Ridge Estates, but proving the connection would be another matter entirely. The security cameras had caught someone in dark clothing and a face mask doing the deed, but the footage was too grainy for a clear identification. They'd known exactly where the camera blind spots were, which meant they'd been watching and planning. The financial hit was bad enough, but the timing was devastating. December in Rolling Hills County meant snow was coming, and feed suppliers were already running low on winter stock. I spent the entire day calling every supplier within 100 miles, trying to secure replacement hay. That's when I discovered the second part of their plan. Somehow word had gotten out that our farm was under investigation for environmental violations. Feed suppliers were hesitant to sell to us, worried about liability issues. Someone, and I had a pretty good idea who, had been making calls, poisoning our business relationships. By late afternoon, I was in my kitchen, surrounded by bills and supplier rejection letters, when I heard a knock at my door. It was Sarah Thompson, the mother who'd stood up for us during the Fall Festival incident. "Jack, you need to see this," she said, handing me her phone. On it was a private Oak Ridge Estates community forum post from Victoria. "Urgent community. Alert. Dangerous chemical contamination discovered at non-compliant agricultural property. All residents advised to avoid any products or contact." The post went on to suggest that our farm had contaminated our own feed through negligent agricultural practices and warned residents about the ongoing health risks of living near an unregulated farm operation. "They're trying to turn the whole community against you," Sarah said. "But some of us know better. My husband works in agricultural supply. He might be able to help with your feed situation." Through Sarah's husband, I managed to secure a partial feed order from a supplier 3 counties over, at nearly double the usual price. It would be enough to get through part of the winter, but the financial strain was exactly what the HOA wanted. That evening, Victoria made her move. She arrived alone, just as the sun was setting, her Mercedes parked at the edge of my property. "Quite unfortunate about your feed storage," she said, not bothering with pretense this time. "Agricultural work can be so hazardous. All those chemicals, safety regulations, environmental concerns. It must be overwhelming for an independent operator." "Cut the act, Victoria. We both know who's behind this." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Accidents and mishaps tend to multiply when properties become problematic. Insurance rates go up, suppliers get nervous, banking becomes complicated. Sometimes the simplest solution is to accept the inevitable. "Is that what you told the other families? The ones Summit Properties forced out?" Her expression hardened. "Those documents you have, they're meaningless. Corporate strategies and planning discussions aren't proof of anything. But chemicals? Property damage, those are very real problems that can have very real consequences." As she turned to leave, she paused. "The HOA is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow about the chemical contamination incident. We'll be discussing increased security measures, property restrictions, and possibly legal action. Of course, all of this could be avoided if you'd reconsider our offer." I watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the growing darkness. Inside, I reviewed my security footage again, looking for any detail we might have missed. That's when I noticed something in the background of one frame, a distinctive silver watch glinting on the perpetrator's wrist. The same watch Marcus Chen always wore. The emergency HOA meeting Victoria had mentioned turned out to be more like a carefully orchestrated propaganda session. Through Sarah Thompson, who attended as a resident of Oak Ridge Estates, I learned exactly how Victoria had manipulated the situation. The meeting was held in their gleaming new community centre, with every seat filled. Victoria had arranged for an environmental expert, later discovered to be on Summit Properties' payroll, to give a presentation about agricultural contamination risks. He showed doctored photos of our feed storage, making it appear far worse than it was, and presented misleading data about chemical spread patterns. "The contamination we've discovered," he announced to the packed room, "could potentially affect groundwater supplies for the entire neighborhood. Property values could drop by 30% or more just from the association with an environmentally hazardous zone." The crowd's reaction was exactly what Victoria had orchestrated. Worried parents asked about their children's safety. Property investors demanded immediate action. Even some of our longtime supporters began to waver in the face of manufactured evidence and expert testimony. But not everyone was buying it. Sarah stood up during the question period, challenging the experts' credentials and methodology. "Where's the official EPA report?" she demanded. "Why haven't state environmental agencies been involved if the threat is so severe?" Victoria smoothly intercepted these questions. "We're handling this at a community level first, following proper protocols. We don't want to create unnecessary panic or regulatory complications." What she didn't mention was that involving actual environmental agencies would expose their fabricated evidence. Instead, she focused on building community pressure. By the end of the meeting, she had volunteers signing up for community safety patrols to monitor our farm's activities. The next morning, I discovered just how effective her fear campaign had been. A group of Oak Ridge Estates residents had formed a human chain at the end of my driveway, blocking my produce delivery truck from leaving. They carried signs reading, "Protect our children" and "No toxic farms." Leading them was Karen Spencer, who just months ago had been buying fresh eggs from us every week. "We can't let you distribute potentially contaminated products," she called out, her voice shaking but determined. "Think about the families." I tried reasoning with them. "The EI contamination was done to us, not by us. We're the victims here." "Then why haven't you joined the HOA?" someone shouted. "They could help regulate and protect your operation." That was Victoria's masterstroke, painting HOA membership as the solution to the very problems they were creating. She had transformed our resistance to their takeover into evidence of negligence. The protest might have continued all day if Officer Martinez hadn't arrived. "This is an illegal blockade of a private business," she informed the group. "Either disperse or face trespassing charges." As the crowd reluctantly broke up, I noticed Lisa Chen watching from her car parked down the street. She gestured for me to meet her later at our usual spot 2 towns over. That afternoon, over coffee, she shared more disturbing news. "They're not just going after your farm," she said, sliding another envelope across the table. "Summit Properties has plans for the entire agricultural district. Your farm is just the first test case. If they can break you, they'll use the same playbook on every independent property in the county." The documents she provided showed a massive development plan. Luxury homes, shopping centers, and office parks stretching across what was currently family farmland. The estimated profit was in the hundreds of millions. "My brother Marcus is meeting with county commissioners next week," Lisa added. "They're pushing for rezoning changes that would make it impossible for farms to operate in the new residential corridor they're planning." Back at the farm, I found More evidence of the community division Victoria had created. Someone had spray-painted "Sell Out" on my barn wall, but right next to it another person had painted "Stand Strong" with a small heart. The mail brought a mix of anonymous threats and letters of support. One envelope contained a check for $5,000 from an elderly couple who'd been forced out of their family farm in a neighboring county. "Fight them," the note read. "Don't let them do to you what they did to us." That evening, I got an unexpected visit from James Cooper, one of the original Oak Ridge Estates residents. He looked nervous as he handed me a USB drive. "I work in IT, he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "I've been monitoring the HOA's internal communications. Victoria's been coordinating with someone named Richardson at Summit Properties. They're planning something big, but they're being careful about putting details in writing." I thanked him, and he hurried away, clearly afraid of being seen. Reviewing the files later, I found coded references to a final solution for the agricultural obstruction. The timing was set for next week, but the specific details were frustratingly vague. In the days following James Cooper's USB drive revelation, the atmosphere around the farm grew increasingly tense. Victoria's community safety patrols had evolved into something more sinister. Groups of Oak Ridge Estates residents constantly circling my property in their luxury SUVs, taking photos and videos of everything we did. I installed additional security cameras and motion sensor lights, but the feeling of being watched was constant. Every time I stepped out to do my daily chores, cameras would appear, documenting my every move. They were building a record of something, but of what? The answer came in the form of another clandestine meeting with Lisa Chen, this time behind a gas station off the highway. She looked even more nervous than usual. "They're documenting normal farm activities to use against you," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus has been working with a team of lawyers to reframe everyday farming practices as nuisance activities under the county code." She showed me draft legal documents where they'd twisted everything. Our early morning equipment use became noise pollution, standard fertilizer application was labeled chemical spraying, and even our irrigation system was being characterized as water rights abuse. "But here's the really concerning part," Lisa continued, pulling out her phone to show me an email thread. "Victoria's been in contact with someone from the fire marshal's office, someone who owes Summit Properties a favor." The implications were clear. They were setting up something that would involve the fire department. But what? The emails were carefully worded to avoid specifics, but the tone was ominous. That same afternoon, I received an official-looking letter from the county fire marshal's office announcing a routine safety inspection scheduled for the following week. The timing couldn't be coincidental. I called Officer Martinez to share my concerns. "Something's coming," I told her. "All these pieces they're putting in place, the documentation, the legal groundwork, this fire inspection, they're building up to something big. I'll keep extra patrols in the area," she promised. But without concrete evidence of a threat, there's only so much we can do officially. The next day brought a new development. A local news van pulled into my driveway. The first media attention our situation had received. The reporter, Andrea Reynolds, wanted to do a story on the community conflict between traditional farming and modern development. I was initially hesitant, but then I noticed how Victoria and her group suddenly seemed unsettled by the media presence. For the first time, their actions would be documented by someone they couldn't control. During the interview, I showed Andrea the progression of harassment, the letters, the chemical attack on our feed, the coordinated pressure campaign. She seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of it. "This isn't just about one farm," I explained on camera. "It's about whether we let corporations use HOAs as weapons to force people off their land." The story was scheduled to air the following week, That's when things got really strange. First, Marcus Chen made an unexpected appearance at my property, not to threaten but to negotiate. He offered double the previous buyout amount, with one condition: I had to sign immediately before the news story aired. "This is a limited-time opportunity," he said smoothly. "After certain events occur, the property value might not be quite so attractive." I refused, but his visit left me deeply unsettled. They were racing against something, trying to wrap this up before whatever they had planned could take place. Then James Cooper contacted me again, this time through Sarah Thompson. He'd uncovered more communications, including a cryptic message from Victoria to the Summit Properties Board. Property acquisition timeline accelerated. Situation will be resolved before media involvement becomes problematic. The next morning, I woke to find someone had cut our main power lines overnight. The backup generator kicked in, but the message was clear. They were testing our vulnerabilities. I spent that entire day reinforcing everything I could think of, checking and double-checking all potential fire hazards, installing additional security lights, even setting up a volunteer patrol system with sympathetic neighbors. Sarah Thompson and a few other supporters took shifts watching the property at night. "We're not letting them win," she declared, setting up a lawn chair near our main gate. "Whatever they're planning, they'll have witnesses, but Victoria had planned for that too." The next day, the HOA passed an emergency resolution prohibiting non-resident loitering in the neighborhood, giving them authority to remove our volunteer watchers. That evening, as I walked my property line doing final security checks, I spotted Victoria and Marcus in an intense discussion with someone I didn't recognize, a man in a fire marshal's uniform. They quickly separated when they noticed me watching. The day before the fire started with an unusual calm. Looking back, it was the kind of deceptive peace that comes before a devastating storm. Victoria's patrols had suddenly stopped, and the constant harassment seemed to pause. Even the HOA's daily complaint letters didn't arrive in my mailbox that morning. Sarah Thompson noticed it too. She called me around noon, her voice tense. "Something's wrong, Jack. The HOA just cancelled their weekly meeting. Victoria's group is never this quiet." I spent most of that day working with my security footage, copying everything to external hard drives. The documentation of their harassment had become my insurance policy, and something in my gut told me I'd need it soon. Around 4 p.m., Lisa Chen made an unexpected appearance at my farm. The first time she'd risked coming to the property directly. She was shaking as she handed me a handwritten note. "I overheard Marcus on the phone," she whispered. "They've got someone inside the fire marshal's office. Something scheduled for tonight, but I couldn't hear the details. Just be careful. Jack." Before she could say more, a black SUV with tinted windows drove slowly past my gate. Lisa practically ran to her car, leaving me with her cryptic warning. The note contained only one line: "Check the electrical inspection records from last week." I spent the next hour on the phone with the county clerk's office, finally reaching someone willing to help. What I discovered was disturbing. The official inspection records had been altered. Someone had added notes about severe electrical hazards and imminent fire risk, notes that hadn't been there in the original report. Officer Martinez responded immediately when I called. "This is evidence tampering," she said, looking over the documents, "but proving who did it." She shook her head. "I'll station a patrol car near your property tonight. Something doesn't feel right." As dusk approached, I noticed increased activity around the Oak Ridge Estates perimeter. Cars I didn't recognize kept circling just far enough away to avoid suspicion. Through my security cameras, I spotted Marcus Chen's distinctive silver watch as he walked the property line, talking on his phone and gesturing toward my barn. James Cooper sent an urgent text through a secure messaging app he'd set up for us. Emergency HOA board email just went out. They're warning residents about potential incident tonight, telling everyone to stay inside. I called the fire department directly, speaking to Chief Rodriguez, whom I'd known for years. "Tom, I have reason to believe someone might try to start a fire on my property tonight. Is there anything you can do?" "Jack," he sighed, "I've got orders from the marshal's office not to respond to your property without their direct authorization. Something about a pending investigation. My hands are tied, but—" He paused. "If I were you, I'd keep my own water sources ready." I spent the next few hours preparing, checking the pressure on our irrigation system, positioning fire extinguishers, and making sure our backup generator was fully fueled. Sarah and a few other supporters wanted to stay and help watch, but I sent them home. If something was going to happen, I didn't want anyone else at risk. Around midnight, the power went out again, not just to my farm, but to the entire street. Through my night vision security cameras, I watched 3 figures in dark clothing moving along my fence line. They were staying just outside the range of my motion sensor lights. Clearly familiar with my security setup, I was on the phone with Officer Martinez when I spotted Victoria's Mercedes parked in the shadows of a side street, its headlights off. "They're here," I told her. "Something's about to happen." "I'm 5 minutes out," she responded. "Don't engage them. Just document everything." The next few minutes seemed to move in slow motion. The figures split up, each taking different positions around my property. I could see them carrying something, but the camera angle couldn't catch what it was. Then I spotted movement near the barn. A 4th person I hadn't noticed before. The figure was doing something at the base of the structure, moving quickly and purposefully. My phone buzzed with an urgent text from James. "Victoria just sent an email to Summit Properties. Final phase initiated. Property will be available for inspection tomorrow morning." The first flash of orange caught my security camera at exactly 12:47 a.m. It started small, just a flicker near the barn's electrical panel. But within seconds the flames began to spread with unnatural speed. This wasn't a random electrical fire. The pattern was too deliberate, too aggressive. I was already running toward the barn when I heard the first explosion. Someone had placed accelerants inside. The fire was following a planned path, engulfing the structure with frightening efficiency. The heat hit me like a wall as I approached, and I could hear the ancient wooden beams beginning to crack. My first thought was for the animals. Thank God I'd moved them to the far pasture after Lisa's warning. Through the smoke, I could see the shadowy figures retreating rapidly, disappearing into the darkness beyond my property line, but I didn't have time to chase them. I had to focus on containing the blaze. I activated our irrigation system, trying to create a barrier to prevent the fire from spreading to other buildings. The backup generator was powering the water pumps, but the pressure seemed lower than usual. Later, we discovered that someone had partially damaged the main water line, limiting our firefighting capability. Officer Martinez arrived just as the barn's roof began to collapse. "Fire department's been delayed," she shouted over the roar of the flames. "Something about a major incident on the other side of town requiring all units." "It's a setup," I yelled back, working to connect more hoses. They arranged a diversion through Taikuja. The smoke, I spotted Victoria's Mercedes still parked in the shadows, watching. Even from this distance, the camera on my phone caught the reflection of flames in her windshield as she calmly observed the destruction she'd orchestrated. The next 15 minutes were chaos. Sarah Thompson and other neighbors began arriving, forming a bucket brigade, but the fire had too much of a head start, fed by whatever accelerants they'd used. All we could do was try to prevent it from spreading while watching 90 years of family history burn to the ground. Chief Rodriguez finally arrived with 2 trucks, but by then it was too late for the barn. "This was deliberate," he said grimly, examining the burn pattern. "Professional job too. They knew exactly where to place the accelerants for maximum damage." As the firefighters worked to fully extinguish the blaze, I noticed something odd. One of the fire marshals, the same one I'd seen talking with Victoria and Marcus, was taking photos, but seemed more interested in documenting the surrounding property than the fire itself. Dawn was breaking by the time the flames were fully out. The barn was a total loss, just charred timbers and ashes, where generations of my family had worked and stored our livelihood. But amid the destruction, I noticed something that made my heart race. One of our security cameras, hidden in an old metal box, had survived the fire. Its memory card might hold the evidence we needed. Victoria made her appearance just as the fire trucks were leaving, playing her part perfectly. "How terrible," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. Several HOA board members had joined her, all wearing expressions of carefully rehearsed sympathy. "If only you'd accepted our help with updating your electrical systems." "Cut the act," I snapped, my patience finally gone. "We both know what really happened here." She smiled that cold smile. "What happened is tragic, but inevitable. Old agricultural structures, outdated wiring. It was only a matter of time. I'm sure your insurance company will be very interested in the fire marshal's official report about your electrical issues." That's when Officer Martinez interrupted. "Speaking of reports," she said, "we'll need statements from everyone who was in the area last night, including you, Mrs. Pierce." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "Of course, though I was home all evening. Many witnesses can confirm that." As she turned to leave, Marcus Chen approached with a folder. "Given this unfortunate incident," he said smoothly, "the HOA would like to present a revised purchase offer. The property value has obviously been impacted, but we're willing to be generous." I took the folder and ripped it in half. "Get off. My property. Your choice," he shrugged. "But without that barn, maintaining a working farm will be challenging. Sometimes accepting reality is the wisest course." After they left, James Cooper slipped me another note. Victoria had already sent an email to Summit Properties. Phase 1 complete. Property now compromised. Proceed with acquisition strategy. The morning after the fire, I sat in Officer Martinez's office, watching as she reviewed the footage from the survived security camera. The video quality was grainy due to heat damage, but what it showed was unmistakable. "There," she paused, "the footage, pointing to a figure placing something at the barn's base. That watch, the silver one reflecting in the firelight. And look at the way they're moving. They know exactly where the cameras are." The figure was wearing Marcus Chen's distinctive watch, and more importantly, they demonstrated intimate knowledge of my security setup. Only someone who had studied our property extensively would know those blind spots. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Around noon, the corrupt fire marshal who'd been working with Victoria showed up at my property, alone. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his clipboard as he approached. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, not quite meeting my eyes, "I'm here about the preliminary fire report." "You mean the report Victoria Pierce paid you to falsify?" I interrupted. He paled visibly. "Look, I never meant for it to go this far. They said it was just about property acquisition, insurance claims, normal development stuff, but arson, I can't be part of that." His conscience had finally kicked in, probably helped by the realization that he could face serious criminal charges. He handed me a USB drive. "It's all here," he said quietly. The original inspection reports they altered, emails about coordinating, the fire department's delayed response, everything. Victoria promised to help my brother's construction company get exclusive contracts with Summit Properties if I played along. I immediately called Officer Martinez, who arrived with a detective from the county's major crimes unit. The fire marshal spent 3 hours giving them a detailed statement. The evidence was damning. Victoria had orchestrated everything, from the falsified safety reports to the strategically planned emergency that kept fire trucks away. The marshal's testimony provided the connection we needed between the HOA leadership and the fire. But Victoria had prepared for this too. By late afternoon, her legal team had already filed a preemptive lawsuit, claiming I had orchestrated the fire myself to frame the HOA. They'd even produced witnesses, HOA members, of course, who would testify they'd seen me acting suspiciously around the barn that night. That's when Lisa Chen made another crucial intervention. She arrived at my house that evening with a laptop. "Marcus keeps everything," she explained, pulling up encrypted files. "He's paranoid about maintaining leverage over his clients. I found these in his private cloud storage. The files contained detailed planning documents for what they called Operation Agricultural Transition. It laid out every step: the harassment campaign, the environmental claims, the coordinated pressure from city officials, and finally, the orchestrated property crisis, their euphemism for the fire. Most importantly, it included a recorded video conference where Victoria explicitly discussed using arson to force the sale. "If traditional pressure fails," she said in the recording, "we create a situation where maintaining agricultural operations becomes impossible. Fire is untraceable if handled correctly." James Cooper added another piece to the puzzle. He'd managed to download the HOA's entire email server backup, including messages Victoria thought she'd deleted. They showed her coordinating with Summit Properties executives, planning each phase of the operation. "They've done this before," James explained, showing me similar plans for other properties. "But they've never been this sloppy with documentation. They got overconfident. I took everything to Officer Martinez and her team. They spent hours going through it all, building a case that went far beyond simple arson. This is organized criminal activity," the detective explained. "Conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and now arson. The DA's office will be very interested." Late that night, as I walked through the remains of the barn, I found something that brought tears to my eyes. My grandfather's old toolbox, scorched but intact, buried under fallen beams. Inside was his journal, where he'd documented building this barn during the Depression. "Built to last generations," he'd written. Looking at those words, I made a decision. This wasn't just about getting compensation for the fire anymore. It was about exposing their entire operation, about stopping them from doing this to other families. I called Diana Reynolds, a lawyer known for taking on corporate developers. She'd helped other farmers stand up to land grabs disguised as community development. "They've given us everything we need," she said after reviewing the evidence. "But be prepared, they're going to fight dirty. They have too much to lose not to." She was right. Within days, Victoria and her allies would launch a counter-offensive that would test every ounce of my resolve. But for the first time since this started, I had something they didn't: proof. Diana Reynolds moved fast. Within 48 hours of taking my case, she had filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Victoria Pierce, Marcus Chen, the HOA board members, and Summit Properties. The damages sought: $600,000 for the destruction of the barn, plus punitive damages for their pattern of harassment and corruption. But Victoria's response showed just how desperate they'd become. The morning after we filed, I woke up to find local news vans parked outside my property. Victoria had launched a media offensive, painting herself as the victim of a disgruntled farmer trying to extort an innocent Homeowners Association. "These allegations are completely unfounded," she told reporters, standing in front of the Oak Ridge Estates gates. "The HOA has only ever acted in the best interests of our community. Mr. Mitchell's property has been a safety concern for months, as documented by official inspections." Marcus Chen stood beside her, adding his legal spin. "The fire was clearly the result of Mr. Mitchell's own negligence. We have witnesses who will testify to seeing him acting suspiciously that night. This lawsuit is nothing but an attempt to exploit a tragic accident." Diana wasn't fazed. "Let them talk," she said as we watched the coverage. "They're just giving us more rope to hang them with." She had already subpoenaed the HOA's financial records, Summit Properties communications, and the personal emails of everyone involved. The first court hearing was set for early the next week. But before we could get there, Victoria tried one last desperate move. She sent an intermediary, a well-known local businessman named Richard Foster, to my farm with an offer. "They're willing to pay you $750,000, he said, sitting at my kitchen table. "More than your lawsuit asks for. All you have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement and drop the case." When I declined, his tone changed. "Think carefully, Jack. Victoria has connections throughout the county. Banking connections, business connections, political connections. This lawsuit goes forward, you might find it very difficult to keep farming here, barn or no barn." I showed him out, but his warning stuck with me. The next day, my regular feed supplier suddenly cancelled our account. The local farm equipment repair shop couldn't fit me into their schedule. Even my longtime insurance agent called to discuss concerns about continued coverage. Lisa Chen confirmed our suspicions. "They're calling in every favor they can," she reported. "Victoria's desperate to stop this from going to court. The Summit Properties Board is getting nervous about exposure, but they'd underestimated the community's response to their tactics. When word got out about the supplier boycott, farmers from 3 counties over offered to help. Sarah Thompson organized a volunteer group to help with repairs. The local farmers market community started a fundraiser to help with legal costs." The morning of our first court hearing, I arrived to find the courthouse steps filled with supporters. Families who'd lost property to similar schemes, farmers fighting corporate takeovers, and even some Oak Ridge Estates residents who'd grown disgusted with the HOA's tactics. Victoria and Marcus arrived in a fleet of luxury cars, accompanied by a team of corporate lawyers. They looked confident until Diana presented our first piece of evidence, the fire marshal's complete testimony, including recorded conversations about coordinating the delayed emergency response. The judge's expression darkened as he reviewed the documentation. "These are extremely serious allegations," he said, looking directly at Victoria. "If proven, they go far beyond civil matters into criminal territory." Marcus immediately tried to distance himself and the HOA from the fire marshal's claims. "Your Honor, these are the desperate allegations of a disgruntled official trying to avoid responsibility for his own misconduct." That's when Diana played her ace. She presented the video conference recording where Victoria explicitly discussed using arson as a property acquisition tactic. The courtroom fell silent as Victoria's own voice filled the room, calmly discussing how to make a fire appear accidental. Victoria's composed facade cracked. She whispered urgently to her lawyers, who quickly requested a recess. When they returned, their strategy had shifted entirely. "Our clients are willing to discuss a settlement," their lead attorney announced. "We believe we can resolve this matter amicably without further court proceedings." But Diana wasn't having it. "Your Honor, this goes beyond a simple property dispute. We have evidence of a systematic criminal enterprise using arson and fraud to force property sales. We'll be referring all documentation to the district attorney's office." The district attorney's involvement changed everything. What had started as a civil lawsuit over property damage suddenly became a full-scale criminal investigation. District Attorney Sarah Coleman assigned her top investigator, Michael Torres, to the case. Torres didn't waste time. Within days of receiving our evidence, he had obtained search warrants for both the HOA offices and Summit Properties local headquarters. The raids happened simultaneously at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. You should have seen Victoria's face, Lisa Chen told me later that day. She was just arriving for her morning HOA meeting when the investigators walked out with boxes of documents and all their computers. She actually tried to block them, claiming they were violating HOA bylaws. The investigation uncovered more than just evidence about my case. Records showed a pattern of similar incidents across 3 states. Summit Properties had been using local HOAs as fronts for their land acquisition scheme for years, always following the same playbook. Form an HOA, harass holdout property owners, create accidents, then swoop in to buy distressed properties. At fraction of their value, Marcus Chen cracked first. Torres brought him in for questioning, and faced with the mountain of evidence, he started talking. His statement was devastating. Victoria had been running this scheme for Summit Properties. For over 5 years, the HOA was specifically created as a pressure tool, with board members chosen for their connections to local officials. She called it community renewal, Marcus revealed in his sworn statement. But it was really about identifying vulnerable properties and finding ways to force sales. The fire, that was supposed to be a last resort. It wasn't the first time they'd used it, but it was never supposed to be traced back to us. The investigation also revealed why Victoria had been so desperate to stop our lawsuit. Summit Properties had a $200 million development deal pending with the county, contingent on acquiring several key properties, including my farm. The exposure of their tactics put the entire project at risk. But Victoria wasn't going down without a fight. She hired Gregory Maxwell, a high-powered criminal defense attorney known for representing corporate executives. His first move was to try to discredit the evidence. The alleged video conference recording was clearly doctored, Maxwell claimed to the press. And the fire marshal's testimony was coerced through threats of prosecution. My client is the victim of a coordinated attempt to extort money from successful business people. That's when James Cooper proved his worth again. He had maintained backups of every HOA communication, including metadata that proved the authenticity of the video conference recording. More importantly, he had records of financial transfers between Summit Properties and various shell companies used to pay off. Officials uncover up previous accidents. The investigation took an unexpected turn when one of Victoria's former assistants came forward. Emily Parker had worked for her during the early stages of the Oak Ridge Estates development. She brought with her a journal documenting everything: meetings, payoffs, strategies for pressuring property owners. Victoria was proud of her system, Emily testified. She called it creative community development. She kept detailed records because she used successful acquisitions to promote herself within Summit Properties. I left when I realized what they were really doing to people. Torres used Emily's information to track down other victims. More families came forward with stories of mysterious fires, sabotaged equipment, and coordinated harassment campaigns. The pattern was always the same. Problems would start after they refused to sell to Summit Properties, and the local HOA would be used as the primary pressure tool. Victoria's carefully constructed world was unraveling. Summit Properties' board of directors called an emergency meeting. Reports leaked that they were discussing whether to cut ties with her and negotiate with prosecutors to limit their corporate liability. That's when Victoria made her final desperate move. Late one evening, Lisa Chen called me in a panic. "They're shredding documents at the HOA office," she reported. "Victoria and some board members have been there for hours. They brought in a mobile shredding service." Torres moved fast, obtaining an emergency court order to stop the destruction of evidence. But by the time investigators arrived, significant damage had been done. The shredding itself, however, became evidence of obstruction of justice, adding to the growing list of criminal charges. The next morning, Victoria was conspicuously absent from the HOA's emergency board meeting. Her house in Oak Ridge Estates appeared empty, and her phone went straight to voicemail. Marcus Chen received a text from her that simply read, "Sorry, had to protect myself. You're on your own." Victoria's disappearance sparked a multi-state manhunt. Her face appeared on local news stations, and the FBI joined the investigation due to the interstate nature of Summit Properties' fraud scheme. But even in her absence, the revelations kept coming. 3 days after she vanished, every board member of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA received an encrypted email. Lisa Chen brought me a copy. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, but I'm not going down alone. In 48 hours, every document, every recording, every transaction will be automatically sent to major news outlets. You all knew what we were doing. Time to face the consequences." It wasn't just a threat, it was Victoria's insurance policy. She had documented everything, keeping detailed records of every person involved in their schemes. The HOA board members panicked, and the domino effect began. Diana Reynolds and DA investigator Torres worked around the clock, interviewing board members who were suddenly eager to talk. The picture that emerged was bigger than anyone had imagined. It went all the way to the county commissioners. Former board member Robert Wilson confessed. Victoria had them in her pocket. Building permits, zoning changes, safety inspections, everything was for sale. Summit Properties kept them well paid through consulting contracts and real estate deals. The corrupt fire marshal wasn't an isolated case. There was an entire network of officials who had helped facilitate Summit's property acquisitions. Building inspectors would find violations on targeted properties. Tax assessors would raise valuations to increase pressure on owners. Police would selectively enforce ordinances. James Cooper worked tirelessly to decrypt Victoria's dead man switch files before they went public. What he found was staggering. Offshore accounts, shell companies, detailed records of bribes and payoffs. Summit Properties had spent millions building their network of corruption. "Look at this," he showed me one evening, pointing to his laptop screen. They had a scoring system for potential acquisitions. Properties were rated based on vulnerability, financial pressures, family situations, health issues. They didn't just target people randomly. They studied us like predators. My farm had been designated a Priority 1 acquisition because of its strategic location. Victoria's notes revealed they'd been planning the operation for over a year before the HOA was even formed. The pressure on Summit Properties became intense. Their stock price plummeted as investors fled. The board of directors fired the CEO and several top executives, trying desperately to distance themselves from the scandal. Marcus Chen, seeing the writing on the wall, made a full confession in exchange for leniency. His testimony was devastating. Victoria wasn't a rogue employee. This was corporate policy. Summit Properties built their entire expansion strategy around these forced acquisitions. They called it aggressive community development, but it was organized crime wearing a business suit. Then, exactly 48 hours after her warning, Victoria's dead man switch activated. Hundreds of documents were automatically uploaded to news outlets and law enforcement agencies across the country. The full scope of Summit's operation was exposed. The revelations hit like a bomb. 3 county commissioners were indicted. Dozens of local officials faced criminal charges. Summit Properties' entire board of directors was implicated in a pattern of racketeering and fraud. Sarah Thompson organized a community meeting at her house to help people understand the extent of what had happened. Former HOA members, many of whom had been unwitting participants in Victoria's schemes, were shocked to learn how they'd been manipulated. She used our legitimate concerns about property values to turn us against our neighbors, Karen Spencer admitted, tears in her eyes. "We thought we were protecting our community, but we were just pawns in their land grab." The FBI finally tracked Victoria to a small town in Mexico. where she'd fled with millions in embezzled funds. But her attempt to escape justice had ultimately backfired. Her dead man's switch had provided prosecutors with everything they needed to build an airtight case. Lisa Chen brought one final piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Victoria and Summit's executives from 6 months earlier. In it, they discussed their plans for my farm in detail. "Once we break him," Victoria had said, "we'll have control of the entire corridor. The development potential is worth tens of millions. A few 100,000 in bribes and one unfortunate fire is a small price to pay." That recording would prove crucial in the criminal trials to come. But for me, it was something else: vindication. Every person who had doubted my stories, who had believed their lies about me being difficult or unreasonable, could now hear the truth in their own words. The day trials began in early spring. The courthouse was packed every day as prosecutors laid out their case against Victoria Pierce, Summit Properties executives, and their network of corrupt officials. Diana Reynolds worked closely with the district attorney's office, ensuring that the civil case remained strong alongside the criminal proceedings. Victoria's arrogance had finally crumbled. Sitting in the defendant's box, she looked nothing like the polished HOA president who had threatened me months earlier. Her designer suits were replaced by plain courtroom attire, her commanding presence diminished by the weight of evidence against her. The prosecution's case was methodical. They started with the smaller incidents: the harassment, the falsified violations, the coordinated pressure campaign, and built up to the barn fire. Each day revealed new details of their criminal enterprise. The defendant didn't just orchestrate an act of arson, Prosecutor James Morrison argued. She created a systematic approach to destroying people's lives and livelihoods for corporate profit. This wasn't business. It was organized crime hiding behind legitimate development. Marcus. Chen's testimony proved devastating. For 3 days, he detailed every aspect of their operation, from selecting targets to covering up crimes. His law background had made him especially valuable in crafting their schemes. Victoria called it creative acquisition, he testified. "We would identify properties crucial to Summit's development plans, then use the HOA as a weapon. The goal was to make owners so miserable they'd sell at any price. If that didn't work..." He paused, glancing at Victoria. More aggressive methods were approved. The corrupt fire marshal's testimony followed. He broke down on the stand, describing how they had planned the barn fire to look like an accident. "They had it all mapped out," he said. "The delayed response, the tampered water lines, the accelerants placed for maximum damage. They'd done it before, but this time they got sloppy." Lisa Chen testified about the documents she'd discovered, explaining how Summit Properties had hidden their criminal activities behind layers of legitimate business. Her brother Marcus wouldn't look at her as she detailed his role in the conspiracy. But the most powerful testimony came from other victims. Family after family took the stand, describing how Summit Properties and their puppet HOAs had destroyed their homes and businesses. Some had lost properties that had been in their families for generations, just as I nearly had. Victoria's defense team tried to paint her as a scapegoat, arguing that she was just following corporate policy. But her own meticulous records proved otherwise. She hadn't just followed the playbook, she had written it, refined it, and taught it to others. During a particularly tense day of testimony, one of Summit's former executives turned state's evidence. He provided emails showing that Victoria had actually developed their aggressive acquisition strategy, earning promotions and bonuses based on how many properties she could force into distressed sales. The jury wasn't out long. After just 6 hours of deliberation, they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts: arson, conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and corruption. Victoria's face remained stone-like as the verdicts were read, but I saw her hands trembling. The civil case was settled shortly after the criminal convictions. Summit Properties, desperate to salvage what remained of their reputation, agreed to pay $600,000 for the destruction of my barn, plus additional damages for their harassment campaign. More importantly, they were forced to abandon their development plans and return properties to families who had been forced out. But the real victory came in the changes that followed. The state legislature passed new laws strengthening property rights and limiting HOA powers. Corporate developers faced stricter oversight and transparency requirements. My case had exposed a nationwide problem, and reforms were spreading. The day of Victoria's sentencing, she finally spoke directly to the court. "I believed I was creating progress," she said, her voice hollow, "replacing the old with the new. I told myself the end justified the means." She turned to face me. "I was wrong. What we destroyed can't be replaced with money or development." The judge wasn't moved by her late remorse. She sentenced Victoria to 15 years in federal prison, with additional time for the state charges. Marcus Chen and other conspirators received lesser sentences in exchange for their cooperation, but none escaped justice entirely. After the sentencing, Sarah Thompson hosted a community gathering at her house. Former HOA members, victims of Summit schemes, and supporters from across the county came together. The divisions Victoria had created were healing. With the legal battles won and justice served, I faced a new challenge: rebuilding what had been destroyed. The $600,000 settlement would cover the construction costs, but restoring 90 years of history and healing a divided community would take more than money. The first sign of real change came from an unexpected source. Karen Spencer, who had once led protests against my farm, arrived at my property one morning with a proposal. She and several other former HOA members wanted to help with the rebuilding. "We were wrong," she said simply, standing where the barn had once been. "We let Victoria convince us we were protecting our community, when really we were helping destroy something precious. Let us help make it right." The rebuilding project quickly became a community effort. Local contractors, many of whom had initially shunned me under HOA pressure, now offered their services at cost. Farmers from across the county brought equipment and materials. Even some former Oak Ridge Estates board members seeking redemption joined the volunteer crews. James Cooper used his IT skills to create a digital archive of the old barn's history, collecting photographs and stories from community members who remembered it through the decades. "We can't bring back the original," he explained, "but we can preserve its memory while building something new." Sarah Thompson organized a fundraising campaign, not for the construction itself, but to create a community trust that would protect local agricultural properties from future development pressure. The Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund quickly grew beyond anyone's expectations. The new barn's design honored the past while embracing the future. We used traditional post and beam construction methods, just as my grandfather had, but incorporated modern safety features and sustainable materials. The footprint remained the same, but the interior was redesigned to better serve both the farm's needs and the community's interest. Lisa Chen, who had risked so much to expose Victoria's crimes, helped design educational spaces within the new structure. "This barn should be more than a building," she suggested. "It should be a reminder of what we almost lost and what we fought to preserve." During construction, we uncovered something remarkable in the old foundation, a time capsule my grandfather had buried when he built the original barn. Inside were photographs, tools, and a letter describing his hopes for the farm's future. "May this barn stand as long as there are people who value the land and the community it serves," he had written. Those words became our inspiration. The new barn would not just be a working agricultural building, but a symbol of community resilience. We incorporated a small museum space to tell the story of the farm, the fire, and the fight against corporate overreach. The construction itself became a daily reminder of how much had changed. People who had once photographed my property looking for violations now brought lunch to the work crews. Children who had been warned away from the dangerous farm now came with their parents to watch the barn take shape. One particularly moving moment came when Robert Wilson, a former HOA board member who had testified against Victoria, arrived with his construction crew. "I spent months trying to force you out," he admitted. "Let me spend months helping you rebuild." The hardest part wasn't the physical construction, it was rebuilding trust. Many community members still carried guilt over their role in the HOA's campaign. Others struggled to forgive those who had supported Victoria's schemes. Healing these wounds required more than hammers and nails. That's when Sarah Thompson proposed the Community Healing Garden, a small plot beside the new barn where neighbors could work together, growing food for local food banks. "Sometimes," she said, "the best way to rebuild trust is to get your hands dirty together." The garden became a place where former adversaries found common ground. HOA members who had never grown so much as a tomato plant learned from experienced farmers. Children from Oak Ridge Estates discovered the joy of pulling carrots from soil their parents had once condemned as a nuisance. As the barn neared completion, we found ways to incorporate elements saved from the fire. The old weather vane, blackened but intact, was restored and mounted on the new cupola. My grandfather's scorched toolbox became a centerpiece in the museum display, a testament to both destruction and preservation. The letter from Victoria Pierce arrived 6 months into the barn's reconstruction. The prison postmark made me hesitate. Before opening it, memories of her threats and manipulations still fresh. Inside was a handwritten confession that would change everything once again. "Mr. Mitchell," she wrote, "I've had a lot of time to think in here. What I'm about to tell you isn't an attempt to reduce my sentence or gain sympathy. It's something you need to know about Summit Properties' ongoing plans." According to Victoria, Summit hadn't given up. Despite the scandal and convictions, they had reorganized under a new name, Horizon Development Group, and were quietly buying up properties in other counties using the same tactics through different HOAs. "They're smarter now," her letter continued. "No paper trails, no emails, everything handled through cutouts and shell companies. But the playbook is the same. I know because I wrote it. I can help stop them, but I need you to trust me." I took the letter to Diana Reynolds and investigator Torres. After verifying Victoria's claims, they arranged a meeting at the federal prison where she was serving her sentence. She looked different, older, tired, the corporate polish completely gone. "I know you have no reason to trust me," she said through the visitor's glass, "but watching the community come together to rebuild your barn, it made me realize how much destruction I caused chasing profit and power." Victoria provided detailed information about Summit's new operation, including names, dates, and locations. More importantly, she revealed the existence of a hidden server containing backup files of all their operations, including the ones under their new identity. "Username is Phoenix Rising, password Summit Falls 2024, she explained. "Marcus didn't know about this backup. It was my personal insurance policy, but now maybe it can do some good." James Cooper worked through the night accessing the server. What he found was staggering, evidence of dozens of planned operations across 5 states, all using the same predatory tactics we had experienced. "They've already set up 3 new HOAs, he reported, showing me the files. Different names, different faces, but the same strategy. They're targeting family farms, historic properties, anything standing in the way of their development plans. The information sparked a new investigation, this time at the federal level, but Victoria's revelation had also created an unexpected dilemma for our community. Some, like Sarah Thompson, saw her cooperation as a genuine attempt at redemption. Others, particularly those who had lost properties to Summit's earlier schemes, viewed it as another manipulation. "How do we trust anything she says?" Karen Spencer asked during a community meeting. "This woman orchestrated campaigns of terror against families. She watched my neighbors lose everything and smiled about it." The debate might have divided the community again, if not for Lisa Chen's intervention. "Maybe trust isn't the point," she suggested. "Maybe it's about using whatever tools we have to prevent other communities from suffering what we did." Diana Reynolds agreed. Working with federal prosecutors, she crafted a deal. Victoria's sentence would remain unchanged, but her cooperation would help establish a task force specifically focused on predatory development practices. The impact was immediate. Using Victoria's information, authorities shut down 2 of Horizon Development Group's operations before they could fully implement their pressure campaigns. Several HOA board members, recognizing the tactics from our case, came forward to expose similar schemes in their communities. But Victoria's contribution went beyond just exposing current operations. She provided insights into how these predatory developers thought, how they selected targets, and how they manipulated community fears and regulations to their advantage. "They look for communities in transition," she explained in a detailed statement, "places where old and new clash, where they can exploit fears about property values and changing demographics. The HOAs aren't just tools for pressure, they're weapons for dividing communities against themselves." This understanding proved crucial as we developed new legislation to protect vulnerable properties. Sarah Thompson worked with state representatives to craft the Community Heritage Protection Act, using lessons learned from our experience and Victoria's insights. During this time, the new barn's construction continued, but its meaning evolved. What had started as a rebuilding project became a symbol of community resilience and redemption. We added a research center focused on documenting and preventing predatory development practices. Victoria's information helped other communities resist similar takeover attempts. Farmers and homeowners from across the country began visiting our barn, learning from our experience and sharing their own stories of resistance. Victoria's second letter arrived just days before the barn's grand reopening ceremony. Inside was a cashier's check for $250,000, her entire personal savings, along with a handwritten note that shook me to my core. "This money can't undo what I did," she wrote, "but maybe it can help protect other families from people like who I used to be. I'm dying, Jack. Cancer. I have less than 6 months. Before I go, I want to try to balance some of the scales." The news hit me harder than I expected. This woman had tried to destroy everything my family had built, had orchestrated a campaign of terror against our community, and yet her impending death brought no satisfaction. Diana Reynolds verified the money was clean. Funds from before. Her involvement with Summit Properties. I called an emergency meeting with the core group who had stood by me through everything: Sarah Thompson, Lisa Chen, James Cooper, and Karen Spencer. We gathered in the almost completed barn to discuss Victoria's final gesture. "She's manipulating you again," Karen warned, her voice sharp with remembered pain. "Even from prison, even dying, she's trying to control the narrative." But Lisa saw it differently. "People can change," she argued. "I watched my brother Marcus transform from a corporate shark into someone who finally faced his conscience. Maybe Victoria's had a similar journey. The debate wasn't just about the money, it was about forgiveness, redemption, and the weight of the past." Sarah suggested a compromise. use the funds to expand the Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund, helping other communities fight against predatory development. James had been quiet, studying Victoria's letter on his laptop. "There's something else," he said finally. "I've been monitoring Horizon Development Group's activities. They're still operating, but they're struggling. Victoria's information didn't just expose their current operations. It revealed their entire methodology. They can't use the same playbook anymore because everyone knows what to look for." The impact of Victoria's cooperation had been far-reaching. 3 state legislatures had passed laws based on our experience, creating new protections for property owners against predatory development tactics. HOAs across the country were under increased scrutiny, with many adopting strict anti-harassment policies. That evening, I visited Victoria in prison. The cancer had taken its toll. She was a shadow of the commanding figure who had once threatened me on my own property, but her mind was still sharp. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice weak but clear. "What I did to you, to all those families, it can't be undone. But watching you rebuild, seeing the community come together instead of tear itself apart like I planned, it changed something in me." She shared one final piece of information: a list of every property Summit Properties had acquired through their pressure tactics over the past decade. "Some of these families might still be able to reclaim their land," she explained. "The statute of limitations hasn't expired on all the cases." The decision about Victoria's money became clear. We would use it to establish a legal defense fund for families trying to reclaim properties lost to predatory development. The fund would also support communities currently fighting against such tactics. The day before the barn's reopening ceremony, I received word that Victoria had been transferred to a medical facility. Her condition had deteriorated rapidly. Despite everything she had done, I found myself visiting her one last time. She was barely conscious, but she gripped my hand with surprising strength. "The barn," she whispered. "Is it finished?" "Almost," I told her. "We're opening it tomorrow. It's become something bigger than just a barn. It's a symbol of resistance against corporate bullying." A faint smile crossed her face. "Good. Maybe that's a better legacy than luxury developments and destroyed communities." She passed away that night. The news reached me just hours before the reopening ceremony. Standing before the gathered crowd, hundreds of people from across the county and beyond, I made a difficult decision. "Today, we're not just celebrating a new barn," I began. "We're celebrating community resilience, the power of standing together against corporate greed, and yes, even the possibility of redemption." Victoria Pierce died last night. She died trying to right some of her wrongs. It doesn't erase what she did, but it reminds us that change is possible. The barn's reopening ceremony became something far more significant than we'd planned. News of Victoria's death, combined with the story of her final acts of redemption, brought media attention from across the country. What had started as a local property dispute had evolved into a national conversation about community, corporate power, and the possibility of change. Hundreds of people attended, including families from other communities facing similar battles. The new barn stood as a testament to resilience, its traditional frame housing modern amenities, and the new community action center we'd established to help other property owners fight predatory development. Sarah Thompson took the lead in organizing educational programs. "This isn't just about preserving farms or fighting HOAs," she explained to a group of visitors. "It's about understanding how communities can protect themselves from corporate predators who use division as a weapon." The Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund, now enhanced by Victoria's final contribution, began receiving applications from across the country. James Cooper developed a database to track predatory development patterns, helping communities identify Warning signs before they became victims, Lisa Chen's role proved crucial in this new phase. Her experience with both sides of the conflict, through her brother Marcus and her own role in exposing the truth, gave her unique insight. She began conducting workshops for HOA board members, teaching them how to recognize and resist corporate manipulation. Most HOAs start with good intentions, she would explain. The problem comes when corporate interests hijack them for their own purposes. What happened here wasn't just about one bad HOA, it was about a systematic abuse of community organizations for corporate profit. Karen Spencer, once one of the HOA's most active members, became an unexpected ally in this educational effort. She shared her experience of being manipulated by Victoria and Summit Properties, helping other HOA members recognize similar tactics in their own communities. They play on our fears, she would tell visitors. Fear of property values dropping, fear of change, fear of losing control. Once you understand their playbook, you can't unsee it, but more importantly, you can fight it. The legal defense fund, supported by Victoria's money, began making an impact. 3 families in neighboring counties managed to reclaim properties. They'd lost to Summit Properties' schemes. Each success strengthened the legal precedents we'd established, making it harder for developers to use similar tactics. One morning, about a month after the opening, I found Robert Wilson, the former HOA board member who had helped with construction, standing in the barn's museum section, staring at the display about Victoria. "You know what the hardest part is?" he said, not turning around. Realizing we weren't just victims of her manipulation, we were willing participants. We chose to believe her because it was easier than questioning our own prejudices. His observations sparked a new initiative. We began hosting monthly community dialogues in the barn, bringing together people from different backgrounds to discuss how to build genuine community connections that could resist corporate exploitation. The impact rippled outward. Other communities facing development pressure started creating their own preservation funds and community action centers. Our barn became a model for how to turn conflict into cooperation, how to transform a symbol of destruction into a beacon of hope. Marcus Chen, now serving his reduced sentence, wrote a detailed guide on recognizing and resisting corporate takeover tactics, which we distributed through our network. His insider knowledge, combined with Victoria's final revelations, created a powerful tool for community defense. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA, under completely new leadership, became an example of reform. They rewrote their bylaws to prevent any future board from engaging in harassment or predatory practices. More importantly, they began working with neighboring farms to preserve the area's agricultural heritage rather than trying to eliminate. In 1 year after the fire, we held a memorial service, not just for the old barn, but for everything our community had lost and gained through this ordeal. People brought photos of other properties lost to corporate development, creating a wall of remembrance that reminded us why our work mattered. 2 years after the fire, our story had sparked a nationwide movement. The Mitchell Farm case, as it became known in legal circles, had set precedents that changed how courts viewed corporate development tactics and HOA overreach. But more importantly, it had shown communities how to fight back. The barn had become more than just a rebuilt structure. It was now a fully functioning community action center, hosting weekly workshops and training sessions. Farmers, homeowners, and community organizers from across the country came to learn from our experience. One morning, I received a call from a farmer in California facing similar pressure from developers. "They're using the same playbook," he explained. "Created an HOA, started the harassment, trying to force us out. But thanks to your resources, we knew what to watch for. We caught them before they could escalate." These success stories became increasingly common. The database James Cooper had created helped identify patterns of predatory development early, allowing communities to organize resistance before situations became critical. In its first 2 years, the Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund had helped protect over 30 properties from forced acquisition. Sarah Thompson expanded her role, traveling to other communities to help them establish their own protection networks. The key, she would explain, is recognizing that this isn't just about individual properties. It's about preserving community identity against corporate homogenization. Lisa Chen's workshops for HOA board members had become so popular that she developed an online certification program. Understanding corporate manipulation tactics became required training for HOA officers in several states, helping prevent other associations from being weaponized, as Victoria had done with ours. The legal landscape was changing too. Diana Reynolds worked with state legislators to craft what became known as the Mitchell Protection Laws, comprehensive legislation that created new safeguards against predatory development practices. 3 states had adopted versions of these laws, with more considering similar measures. Even Marcus Chen contributed from prison, providing detailed testimony to congressional hearings on corporate development practices. His insider knowledge, combined with Victoria's final revelations, helped shape new federal guidelines for corporate real estate development. The Oak Ridge Estates community had transformed as well. The new HOA board, led by Karen Spencer, created a pioneering program that partnered with local farms to provide residents with fresh produce and educational opportunities. The very properties they had once tried to eliminate became valued community assets. One particularly meaningful moment came when Robert Wilson's daughter decided to start a small urban farming project in Oak Ridge Estates. The HOA not only approved it but provided funding through a new community agriculture initiative, a complete reversal of their former stance. The museum section of our barn continued to grow, now including stories from other communities who had successfully fought off predatory developers. Each tale added to our understanding of how these tactics evolved and how to combat them effectively. James Cooper's monitoring system had identified over 50 potential predatory development schemes in their early stages. By sharing this information through our network, communities could prepare their defenses before the pressure campaigns began. The developers' old playbook simply didn't work anymore when people knew what to watch for. The impact extended beyond just fighting corporate developers. Communities began using our model to address other challenges, from environmental protection to historic preservation. The idea that local communities could successfully stand up to powerful interests had taken root. One day I received a letter from Victoria's daughter, who had never publicly commented on her mother's actions. "What you've built from the ashes of my mother's crimes," she wrote, "is remarkable. You turned destruction into protection, hatred into healing. That's a legacy I can finally be proud to connect with." The Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund, bolstered by Victoria's final contribution and ongoing donations, had grown into a substantial force for community protection. We were able to provide not just legal support, but also emergency funding to help properties resist pressure tactics like those we had faced. During a national conference on community preservation held in our barn, a speaker from the Environmental Protection Agency noted that our case had fundamentally changed how they approach development disputes. The Mitchell case showed us that community resistance isn't just about individual properties, he said. It's about protecting the fabric of American communities from corporate dismantling. 3 years after the fire, what started as a local fight for survival had evolved into something none of us could have imagined. The movement we'd built wasn't just protecting properties anymore. It was reshaping how communities across America thought about development, corporate power, and local rights. A pivotal moment came when the Smithsonian contacted us about featuring our story in an exhibit on modern American community resistance. They wanted to display pieces of the original barn, alongside documentation of our fight and its nationwide impact. The curator explained, "Your story represents a turning point in how ordinary citizens can stand up to corporate overreach." During the process of selecting items for the exhibit, we uncovered more of my grandfather's documents in the old barn's foundation. Among them was a letter he'd written during the Great Depression, describing his fight to keep the farm when banks were foreclosing on his neighbors. "The land is more than property," he wrote. "It's the foundation of community, and some things are worth fighting for." Those words became the motto of our expanded mission. The Mitchell Farm Protection Network, as it became known, now had chapters in 37 states. Each chapter adapted our model to their local needs while maintaining the core principle. Communities, standing together, could resist even the most powerful corporate interests. Sarah Thompson developed a comprehensive training program that became known as the Community Defense Playbook. It taught local organizers how to recognize early signs of predatory development, build community solidarity, and protect vulnerable properties before crises emerged. The key, she would explain in her workshops, isn't just fighting back when they come for your property. It's building such strong community bonds that they think twice about targeting you in the first place. James Cooper's monitoring system had grown into a sophisticated national database. By tracking corporate land acquisitions, HOA formations, and development patterns, we could now predict where the next attempts at community displacement might occur. This early warning system had prevented dozens of situations like ours from escalating. Lisa Chen's work with HOA reform had led to a revolutionary new model of community organization. Protective HOAs, as they became known, specifically included glosses that prevented them from being used as weapons against community members. The model was so successful that several states were considering making these protections mandatory for all new HOAs. The legal landscape had shifted dramatically too. Diana Reynolds now headed a national network of attorneys specializing in community protection law. The precedents set by our case had been used to protect everything from historic urban neighborhoods to rural farming communities from predatory development. Even Marcus Chen, nearing the end of his reduced sentence, had become an unexpected asset. His insights into corporate tactics, combined with Victoria's final revelations, helped us stay ahead of developers' evolving strategies. "They're still out there," he warned during a phone consultation. "They're just getting smarter about hiding their tactics." One morning, I received a call from a farmer in Maine. Developers had been pressuring his community to sell, using many of the same tactics we'd faced, but because of our network, they were prepared. "Your fight showed us how to stand together," he said. "We're not just protecting our farms anymore, we're protecting our way of life." The barn itself had become something of a pilgrimage site for community activists. Every week brought visitors wanting to learn from our experience or share their own stories of resistance. We added a conference center and training facility to accommodate the growing demand. Karen Spencer, once one of my strongest opponents in the HOA, now ran our outreach program. "The most powerful weapon developers have is division," she would tell visitors. "Once communities learn to stand together, that weapon becomes useless." The Burt Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund had grown beyond our wildest expectations. Through donations and strategic partnerships, we were able to provide not just legal support, but also emergency assistance to communities facing immediate threats. The fund had helped save over 100 properties in the past year alone. Perhaps most significantly, our story had sparked a national conversation about the relationship between development and community rights. Congressional hearings on predatory Development practices cited our case as a turning point in understanding how corporations could manipulate local organizations for their own benefit. 5 years after the fire that nearly destroyed everything, I stood in the rebuilt barn's observation tower, watching a new generation of community activists gather below. They had come from all across the country for our annual Community Protection Summit, each with their own stories of resistance and triumph. The farm had grown into something my grandfather could never have imagined. Beyond the original 20 acres, we'd helped establish a network of protected agricultural properties throughout the county. The Mitchell Farm Protection Network now served as a model for communities worldwide facing similar threats. That morning, I had received a letter that brought everything full circle. Summit Properties, now under completely new management, had announced the permanent dissolution of their residential development division. The pressure from our movement, combined with the legal precedents we'd established, had made their old business model unsustainable. Sarah Thompson, addressing the gathered crowd, summed up our journey perfectly. What started with one farmer refusing to be bullied has grown into a revolution in how communities protect themselves. We didn't just save a farm, we created a blueprint for resistance. The impact of our fight continued to ripple outward. The Mitchell protection laws had now been adopted by 38 states, creating robust safeguards against predatory development tactics. Our legal defense fund had helped protect over 500 properties, from historic urban neighborhoods to multi-generational farms. James Cooper's monitoring system had evolved into a sophisticated AI-powered platform that could predict development threats before they materialized. "We're not just playing defense anymore," he explained to a group of tech volunteers. "We're changing how development happens in this country." Lisa Chen had recently published a book about our experience, Standing Ground: How One Community Changed the Face of Development in America. It had become required reading in urban planning programs and law schools, ensuring that future generations would understand the importance of community rights. The barn itself had become more than just a building. Its museum section now included artifacts and stories from hundreds of communities that had successfully fought off predatory developers. Each item told a story of resistance, resilience, and ultimate triumph. Karen Spencer, who had once led protests against my farm, now directed our national outreach program. "The greatest victory," she often said, "isn't just in saving properties, it's in transforming how communities see themselves and their power to resist corporate pressure." Even Marcus Chen, after serving his sentence, had found a way to contribute positively. He traveled the country, speaking to law students about corporate accountability and the importance of ethical development practices. His insider perspective proved invaluable in helping communities understand and counter modern development tactics. The Mitchell Farm Preservation Fund had grown into a powerful force for community protection. Through strategic partnerships and grassroots support, we were able to provide comprehensive assistance to communities facing development pressure. The fund now managed over $10 million in assets, all dedicated to protecting vulnerable properties and communities. Victoria's legacy, too, had evolved in unexpected ways. Her final act of redemption had inspired other corporate insiders to come forward, exposing similar schemes across the country. The information she provided continued to help communities protect themselves years after her passing. One morning during the summit, I found myself walking the property with my young niece. She stopped at the memorial wall, where hundreds of photos showed properties saved by our movement. "Uncle Jack," she asked, "why did you decide to fight instead of selling?" I thought about everything we'd been through: the harassment, the fire, the legal battles, and ultimately the triumph. "Because some things are worth more than money," I told her. "Sometimes you have to stand your ground not just for yourself, but for everyone who might come after you." As the summit drew to a close, we gathered for our traditional sunset ceremony in the barn. Representatives from communities across the country shared their stories of resistance and victory. Each tale reinforced what we'd learned, that when communities stand together, they can overcome even the most powerful corporate interests. The fight wasn't over, of course. Developers still tried to force out unwilling property owners, and HOAs still sometimes overstepped their bounds. But now there was a network of support, a tested strategy for resistance, and legal precedents to protect community rights. Looking out over the gathered crowd, I could see the legacy of our struggle written in their determined faces. Farmers, urban homeowners, small business owners, all united in the belief that communities have the right to determine their own future. The barn's bell rang out across the fields as the sun set, just as it had every evening since my grandfather first built it. Its sound carried a message that now resonated across the country. Some things are worth fighting for, and when communities stand together, they cannot be defeated. As darkness fell, and the summit participants began their journeys home, each carrying a piece of our story back to their own communities, I knew that what had started as one farmer's stand against corporate bullying had grown into something immortal, a testament to the power of community, the importance of standing ground, and the enduring strength of people united in a righteous cause. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.